Welcome to GDC, everybody. Today we're going to talk about my project, KeyForge. On Board Game Design Day, KeyForge, creating the world's first unique deck game. I'm Brad Andrews, and let's get to it. So, first of all, who am I? Well, as I just told you, I'm Brad Andrews. I'm a card game developer for Fantasy Flight Games. I've been working there for about 8 years now, and during my time there, I've worked on a lot of different projects. So let's quickly talk about a few of them. First game I worked on was Warhammer Invasion, one of our LCGs. Then another LCG, Call of Cthulhu. Warhammer 40,000 Conquest was the next game I designed, working with Eric Lang. Then Legend of the Five Rings, the card game with Nate French and Eric Dahlman. And last but not least, I guess this game, KeyForge, Call of the Archons with Richard Garfield. But for today's presentation, we're going to talk about a couple different things. First of all, what the heck is KeyForge? Then we'll talk about some of the challenges we faced on making such a weird, different game, and we'll get exactly why this game is so weird in a minute. Then we'll talk about what's next for KeyForge, what's coming up in the future, and where are we taking this concept. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So, what is KeyForge? Well, KeyForge is, as you saw in the talk's title, the world's first unique deck game. It's designed by legendary game designer Richard Garfield of Magic the Gathering, Netrunner, and recently Artifact fame. It's very different than a traditional TCG in the following ways. So, no two decks have the exact same composition. Each and every deck has a unique name. Each and every deck has a unique card back, and decks are not customizable. These set it apart and make it a really weird thing. But how exactly do we want to make a game like this? We started KeyForge with a really distinct philosophy. And I think it's best put in a quote by Richard Garfield that we had in the rulebook. I've always been attached to good procedurally generated content. Game worlds generated in this way really feel as though they belong to me, the player. I am often discovering them as I play. The designer didn't even know they existed. Often games with such content are extremely managed experiences. Everyone goes through the same storylines and can experience the same gameplay by making the same decisions. Everything they experience feels planned. The contrast feels to me like the difference between exploring a jungle and walking in an amusement park. Now what he meant by this is when you go to an amusement park, when you go to Disney World, you know where all the rides are. You get a map right at the beginning. You know where to get on the roller coaster, where to do the tilt-a-whirl, where to get your cotton candy, and where to go to the bathroom. And you know the kind of fun that you're going to have on all those things. You know how you like roller coasters. You know how you like the tilt-a-whirl. But you walk through the jungle. You go on a safari. You're going down a trail, and you're not quite sure what you're going to see. You're not sure what you're going to experience. But you know it's going to be uniquely yours. You could walk down that same trail 1,000 times, and each and every time you would see different things. You would have a different experience. Richard really wanted to take that concept and capture it in a game, one where no matter what happened, you weren't going to run into the same decks week after week. You weren't going to have the same matchups week after week. You weren't going to know what you were going to run into every week. And so that's where his impetus for KeyForge came from. So, what makes KeyForge unique? Each and every deck is an Archon. Now, our Archon is our player insert. It's the way you interact with the game world, and it's representative of your deck. That character is made of a combination between a unique card back and a unique name. Now, again, each and every one of these completely distinct throughout the entire world. Now, each deck made out of 37 cards. 12 of those cards are from 3 different houses, the game's factions, and the last is an Archon card representing your character, and on the back of it, showing the deck list, all the cards that are in your deck and their rarities. Now, that deck consists of action cards, artifacts, creatures, and upgrades, just to show you guys the kinds of variety we have in there. Now, KeyForge is played very differently than many other TCGs. Oftentimes, those games devolve into an attempt to beat the other player in the face, if you will. Whereas KeyForge is you're trying to beat your opponent to the punch. It's a race to the finish. And players will do that by collecting a resource, or a victory point, called amber. Now, players will collect amber throughout the game by doing various things. This includes using their creatures, playing cards, and a whole host of other ways. But as players collect amber, if they start their turn with 6 of them, they will spend them and forge a key. The first player to forge 3 keys wins the game. However, there's a unique twist to KeyForge, and that is that it doesn't have a resource. Like many other games that have a mana or credits or any sort of point you spend to play cards, in KeyForge, you're instead going to choose 1 active house each turn. And I told you earlier that each deck consists of 12 cards of 3 different houses, which means that you're roughly activating 1/3 of your deck every turn. When you have a house as your active house, you're going to be able to play cards at that house, use cards in play, and discard cards. So you need to really be careful how you're managing both the cards that are in your hand and in play, so you can have the maximum amount of effect on the game space. Now, let's talk a little bit about the flavor of the Crucible, KeyForge. So, KeyForge takes place on a world called the Crucible. It's an artificial planet in the center of the universe, and it's made by some mysterious beings that people don't really know that much about on the Crucible. They're called the Architects. At least, that's what everyone calls them. And the only native inhabitants of the Crucible are the Archons. They show up mysteriously and do various deeds across the land and earn their names that way. The other native thing to the Crucible is amber, as we previously talked about. It grows pretty much everywhere and is a psychoreactive substance, meaning that it responds to the hopes, dreams, and thoughts of the people that hold it or try to use it. And, of course, the Crucible being an artificial planet, it is made of the pieces of hundreds of thousands of different worlds from across the universe. Now, that means when you take a piece of the world, put it on the Crucible, it means that all the wildlife, all the people, all the different things come with it, merging together and bringing countless alien cultures together. Now, those cultures work together to try and survive such a weird and strange world. And let's talk a little bit about those cultures. First of which is the Brobnar, which are our Viking techno-barbarians. They're full of giants and goblins, and they believe that the strongest are the most right, the most correct. And so that's how they live their society. Now, mechanically, that means they focus on fighting. They love getting in a good scrap. And they have the powerful creatures they need to back it up. They also have lots of abilities to deal direct damage, just playing a card and dealing 3 damage to something. The Dees are bizarre demons and imps that live below the surface of the Crucible. And they are entirely incapable of emotion themselves, so they need to steal the emotions of others by capturing in an amber. Now, their mechanics focus on board control, hand manipulation, and harrying effects, making them kind of our catch-all control faction. The Logos, my personal favorite, are the mad scientists of the Crucible. They tinker and experiment constantly and have kind of forgotten what their previous bodies looked like as they've modified themselves with cybernetics. They're very much science for the sake of science, asking can they rather than should they. Mechanically, they focus on hand management, drawing cards, putting cards aside for later, discarding cards from their hand to improve their draw, and cross-faction play, letting them continue to manage that hand and the board state. They also have more artifacts than any other faction, which makes sense for all the gizmos and gadgets they're always creating. Next, a little closer to home, is Mars, which literally classic sci-fi Martians. They live in a 2-tiered society with the taller Martians being in control of the shorter ones, and I don't know where that idea came from. But they're very, very xenophobic. They don't, at least the taller ones are, and they don't get along as well with everyone else on the Crucible. Now, this is reflected in their mechanics, in that they're very self-synergistic. They work very well with themselves, but not with other factions. They also have powerful abduction effects, causing your opponent to capture their own amber, so when you destroy their creatures, you get it instead. In addition to that, they have key defense effects, increasing the cost of your opponent's keys, so they have to gather more and more amber in order to be able to beat you. The Sanctum are a religious order of knights and spirits. They live on floating cities throughout the Crucible and try and maintain law and order the best they can. And they're on a quest for enlightenment, trying to figure out exactly why they're here on the Crucible and gain transcendence from it. Mechanically, they're very defense-focused. They have more armor in their faction than any other, and armor allows them to shrug off damage. They also, to benefit that, have a lot of healing, so if you do manage to damage them, they have the capability to heal that right up. They'll also prevent their opponent from being able to forge keys by taking their amber away and holding on to it for a bit. The Shadows is a sneaky society of thieves, full of dark elves, and they love amassing treasure. They can't get enough of it, and more just the physical act of taking it and hoarding it rather than exactly what that treasure is. So after coming to the Crucible, they fell in love with amber. Now, mechanically, it makes sense. They have amber control. They are the best faction at stealing amber from their opponent, which is an extremely effective way of gaining it yourself. It's also hard to hit. They have a lot of the keyword elusive, which means that your opponent will have to spend 2 creatures for every one they attack. And they get some pinging damage for harrying their opponent, doing a point of damage here and there, and softening them up for some of their smaller creatures to finish off. Last but not least, it's the Untamed. They represent the flora and fauna of the Crucible, the beasts, fairies, and witches that live in the wilds, either by choice or because they've been shunned by their communities. And using the effects of amber, they have mutated themselves, often into bigger, stranger, and more powerful forms. Mechanically, Untamed is the best house at gaining amber, just pure amber gain. And that, coupled with their ability to instant key buy outside of that first step of the turn, makes them a formidable force. They also can get their cards back from the discard pile more frequently than any other. So what challenges did we face during the development of this game? So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different categories of challenges today, the first of which being mechanical. Next, we'll talk about the testing we did, and then we'll talk about the user experience, how we made this game work with such a strange and different concept. So, mechanical. What types of challenges did we face? We had to figure out how we were going to make decks that were entirely unique, how we were going to ensure that those decks were entirely unique, how we were going to figure out how each of these decks was going to be named, and how the heck we were going to possibly make card backs unique for every single deck out there. So, how does a deck get made? We have the almighty algorithm to thank for that. The algorithm is a collection of tons of different rules, regulations, and restrictions that cause a deck to be in the form that we desire. When we hit the button to make a deck, the first thing the algorithm does is collect all those rules. Gets them together. Some of these are as simple as like, there's 37 cards in the deck and 1 Archon card. There's 3 houses. Those sort of things. Basic stuff all the way up to very, very, very interesting stuff I wish I could tell you more about. But the next step is it's going to choose houses for that deck. And this is important because those houses are going to dictate all the other choices that the algorithm is making when it's building a deck. Then it's going to start to generate some cards. And it goes 1 faction at a time, filling in the deck list with all of the different cards that can possibly be in it. Now, when it's doing that, each time it's generating a card, it's making a rarity calculation when it's rolling that card individually. Then it's looking if there's any variants of that card. Now, this would be an example that some cards in KeyForge have more than 1 version of that card. Master of 1, 2, and 3 is a perfect example. It's a card that all of the numerical values on the card change for each different version, and you never know which one you're going to get. Now, there's also some companion cards, a card that always comes with a different card. And if you look under the logos, the center section there, you can see that there is a time traveler and help from future self there. Now, those cards always come together. You never see them separate, and they have a strong synergy with one another and interact well. Now, brace yourselves. We got a math alert. So if you have a weak constitution, I'd recommend leaving the room now. Because we're going to talk about ensuring uniqueness. Now, to do this, we're first going to talk about the maximum number of decks. There's 369 non-fixed cards in KeyForge and 36 cards per deck, which means we can take 369 to the 36th power, which gives us 259 novem vigintillion decks. Now, big number. But most of these decks ignore our rules. They're just an abstract possibility. We have cards that are divided by house, we have cards that are different rarities, and we have a ton of other rules that dictate exactly what cards can possibly go into a deck. Now, if we take all of those into consideration, we get a much, much more reasonable 104 octillion decks, which is still enough for each person on the planet to have billions and billions of decks unique to them. But how do we solve this? We actually have a really interesting mathematical problem called the birthday problem. And that states that if you get a group of people together, such as we are here today, that the possibility that they have a shared birthday between two of the people in a particular group is dictated by this equation. Now, at 23 people in a room, there's a 50% probability that two people have the same birthday. And at 70 people, there's a 99.9% probability. So I think we probably have two people that have the same birthday in the room today. Now, if we analyze this for KeyForge, where D is the number of possible decks and N is the number of decks we generate, we can get a table that looks something like this. So on the left is the number of decks we generate, and in the center is the expected number of duplicate decks. So you can see that it takes us making 15 trillion decks before we can even expect to see one duplicate. And I can tell you we haven't made that many. But just in case, we also do a uniqueness check that checks a code against every other deck that's been generated just to ensure that no two decks have the same composition. So there you go. Now, in terms of making card backs, we use a multi-part construction consisting of 7 different pieces. Now, first is the body, the head, the left and right arm, the background, the symbol in the center of the card, and the color. Now, these are all randomly generated because, well, there's no other way to do this part of the card. But it's very interesting because the only way we can make this game is through digital printing. Traditional printing methods for a card game or even a board game don't apply here because typically board games use a process called black plate replacement. They print their cyan, magenta, and yellow layers first, and then they leave the black layer separate so that they can print in multiple different languages and they don't have to pay for more plates that way. Now, we have to use digital printing because KeyForge, well, we're only printing one of each deck. We're not trying to print a ton of the same deck. So that's the only way we could go. Additionally, we do a uniqueness check for card backs by giving each and every piece of a card back a unique part of a code. When you line those codes all up, we can quickly check those numbers against one another and tell if we've used the same card back before. Now, another unique thing we have to do is figure out how decks get named. To do that, we have built a series of blueprints that look sort of like this, and by sort of I mean exactly like this, that generates all of those different names that you might have seen. Now, Those blueprints are filled out by word lists. And we have 18 different ones. I'd tell you exactly what they were, but that'd be telling too much. But those word lists are pulled in to fill in those blueprints based on the different qualities of the cards in the deck. Whether it's a card that's more aggressive, deals damage, prevents your opponent from forging keys, all of those factor in to the eventual name of that Archon. They qualify that deck for those different word lists. And once the deck has gone through and checked for all the word lists it qualifies for, then all the word lists the blueprints get filled out, and you can see we get stuff like Enforcer Wezel Repo Face, the man who notably yearns for height, it's not me, and the king that surrounds porridge. And again, we take these and we do a uniqueness check to make sure we're not repeating ourselves and that each and every name is unique to the person that opens it. Now, so that gets past some of our mechanical hiccups we had to figure out and solve. But how did we test this game? I'm going to talk about a little bit about our methodology and some of the questions we wanted to answer from our testing. So, in terms of methodology, we used an advanced, specialized technique. We played it a lot. We used over 40 different groups, which is much more than typical for KeyForge. And we had over 2 years of testing, both internally, externally, and through our beta tests. This was an intense period, and we used a lot of different internal techniques to answer some of the most compelling questions to us about what makes KeyForge tick. And those focused on player skill versus deck strength, which is more influential to the success of a player. And to do that, we broke it down into 3 different tasks. The first 2 I'm going to tell you about right now, and we'll get to the third in the third section of the talk. Now, how influential is deck composition? Task 1. We created 60 different decks and divided those 60 decks into 10 groups of 6. Then we split those groups among our testing groups, doing this 4 times for our 40 different groups. Now, Group 1 would receive decks from set A and B, 2 from B and C, and so on and so forth. This ensured that each deck existed in 2 different environments, and we could see how its success in those different environments would vary. And this would give us an idea of how important that composition was, regardless of who was playing that deck. Now, when we did this, we had some really encouraging meta implications. We had some decks that would dominate in both different groups they were in, some that would only dominate in one, and some that would dominate in neither. And to us, that felt like, man, there's a lot of possibilities for KeyForge. And your local meta is going to be so interesting. And when you go to a different tournament, that can be completely different. That furthers the idea of discovery that we wanted to bring forth for the players. And it's always been at our core of what makes KeyForge so fun and interesting, is there's always something to discover. Now, task 2, we wanted to figure out how important is player skill. So we had players take some of their favorite decks from the first part of testing and play a series of 20 matches with them. Now, after 10 matches, the players would switch decks. That way we could see whether it was the player skill or the deck strength that was really the culprit behind the success. And we often found that higher skilled players would in fact win more games in total, regardless of what deck they were using. This was very encouraging because it meant that a player could in fact be more skilled at KeyForge than another, which with a game with such variety was really an important thing for us to find out. Now, last but not least, let's talk about the user experience. How do you engage a player base with a game that's so bizarre and different? How do you make them feel like this is something they can rely on and invest in? We focused on ease of entry, flexibility in product, and making sure that players had tons of resources to aid their engagement and involvement in KeyForge. So first of all, ease of entry started from day one in design. We wanted to create a low barrier of entry just in how the game was put together. We did this by creating a streamlined series of decision points. Now, this means that each turn, you're selecting an active house. This unclutters a turn. It makes it much more easy to process and go through because you're making your hardest decision right at the beginning. After you've made that hard decision, you're just left with a series of smaller, lighter decisions of what order are you going to do things in. This alleviates a lot of analysis paralysis that players face because once they've made that hard decision, they just can go to the races. We also used a lot of warm language on cards, making it really easy to read and understand what effects did. This is important because players can often feel intimidated when they pick up a card and they have no idea how it functions. So that was something we made sure to focus on very early. We also wanted to have simple card effects be at common. Now, common cards are the most frequently pulled into decks. And so by having more simple effects there, ones that were easy to grok, understand, and play with, we made sure that we kept the complexity of the game lower. In fact, the main philosophy behind rarity in KeyForge is focused not on power level, like in many other games, but on how complex the card is, how involved the card is for a player to use, and how much game knowledge is required. That way, as a player buys and continues their KeyForge career, they can learn those complexities a small bit at a time. Each time they play a game and encounter a new rare, then they'll learn something more about the game. We often have players, even now, discovering new rares that they've never seen before, which, again, is another point of discovery and fun for a player. We also wanted to have ease of entry in product design. We focused on a low cost for decks. Early on in the process, we determined we wanted decks to be $9.95 so that anyone could come in, pick up a deck of KeyForge, and just start playing. Now, also coupled with only needing a single purchase to play KeyForge. Sure, you can buy our starter set, but any player is just as well equipped by going to their store and picking up a single Archon deck. And I've often heard players say something like, hey, I'll get your first KeyForge, just implying that they'll walk into the store and both buy Archon decks and sit down and play a new game, having, again, that moment of discovery of this new deck. We also included quick start rules, both online and in the starter set, that allowed a player to get going in 10 to 15 minutes. That way there's no fumbling through a rule book for an hour or two. You can get going and start playing KeyForge as soon as possible. This flexibility in product is also reflected in our enormous pile of formats, of which I'll share just a few with you guys today. Formats meaning how a player plays the game and what structure is a tournament set up in. So sealed, meaning that you show up to your game store, you buy a single Archon deck, you open it up, and then you play a tournament with it. This fosters so many different interesting discovery moments as you're learning how your deck plays along with everyone else that's learning how their deck plays. Archon format is our bring your best deck and play a tournament with it format. It's our most bread and butter vanilla format, which more TCG players will be at ease with and will be able to understand. Adaptive is one of our more interesting formats in which players will bring their decks, they'll play a game with them, and then they'll switch decks with their opponent, playing a second game. Then, if each player has won one game at that point, players will then bid chains for the deck that won both games. We'll get to what chains are in a minute, excuse me. We also have survival format, in which players will bring multiple decks, and each time they lose with one of those decks, that deck is out of the tournament. The last player with decks left wins. Then, reversal, in which players bring a deck they feel like they can beat, they know how to beat. And at the beginning of each tournament round, they'll switch decks with their opponent who has also brought a deck they feel like they can beat. And you'll play against the same deck every single round of the tournament instead of playing and play with a new deck every round. which has been a really fun and exciting format that has added a lot of value to decks that players may not feel like are up to par with some of their other decks, meaning that more of your purchases are in fact valuable. So, I mentioned I'd talk about chains and task 3 earlier, and here they are. Chains are a handicapping mechanic we've added to KeyForge. And it's really important because it allows players to even the odds. No matter what decks that you open, you can always use chains to bring those decks into parity with one another. So even if you only want to go out and buy 2 decks and play with a friend, you'll be able to play those 2 decks no matter how good they are. Chains are a mechanic that restrict the number of cards you're allowed to draw at the end of your turn, slowing down decks that earn more of them and giving decks that don't have chains a better chance against them. There's also powerful cards in the game that cause a player to gain chains, meaning that if you push too hard, you may be causing yourself the game because of it. Additionally, our weekly tournament type is called a chain-bound tournament. This lets us use chains to help regulate a local metagame. Every week that a player comes and plays, depending on how successful they are during that week, their chains are added to their deck, which will then be there in subsequent weeks of the tournament. So as the weeks go on, the meta at the local level will be changed by this. Players that will rank up their decks in chains will then have to either continue playing with a handicap deck or switch to a different deck, meaning that every week you come to play at KeyForge is a different story, giving you another moment of discovery. We also wanted to give tons of different player resources, and these all focused on our Master Vault app and website. Now, Master Vault app and website provides a reference hub for players, a place to go and find all things KeyForge. There we track the decks, how many chains they have, and the number of wins and losses they've had in tournament play. It also shows off a mechanic we call the power level of the deck. Now this ensures that decks that are doing well are increasing in power levels, and each different type of tournament or experience we have for players has a power level regulation in which you can't play decks above a certain power level in that. That means, for example, we just had a Vault Tour this last weekend. It's our premium play experience. Each deck that won the Vault Tour is now power level 8, meaning that those decks can't compete at those weekly chain-bound tournaments anymore, because those decks have proven exactly how powerful they are. And we can let the chain-bound tournaments that those decks would normally participate in evolve and change. The Master Vault website also allows players to find stores with KeyForge events. I'm also happy to say that that number of decks registered you see down in the corner passed 700,000 just a couple days ago. So, but what's next for KeyForge? And that is our first new set called Age of Ascension, just announced about a month ago. Now, Age of Ascension is going to add 204 new cards to the KeyForge environment, but it's also going to bring along 166 cards from the first set, Call of the Archons. Now this is really intriguing and interesting because most other TCGs wouldn't be able to do something like this because players already have those cards. They wouldn't want more of them. But in KeyForge, those 166 cards are given new life, a new experience, because they're alongside 204 completely new cards. The value of those 166 cards changes inherently based on the other cards that are in your deck. So you'll see powerful favorites, but they're going to be in a completely new context, allowing you to discover them all over again. Additionally, we also have a legacy card mechanic. Now, legacy cards are rare cards that are from previous sets, and they're pulled into the current set, again, only very rarely. This means that every single card that is in Call of the Archons can be found in an Age of Ascension deck. And when a player finds one of those legacy cards, it acts as another cool moment of discovery, something new, something different, something they weren't expecting. And so whenever you open a KeyForge deck, you never know what you're going to get. We've also introduced a bunch of new mechanics that you can check out the Fantasy Flight Games website to see what we've been premiering so far. It should release in the second quarter of this year, and we're incredibly excited. But that's it for me today. We have time for some questions now. There is a microphone stand right in the center of the room, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please line up there, and we'll get to it.
Hello.
Oh, and please say your name and where you're from. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jay. I'm from Southern California.
Hey, Jay.
Can I call you Quixo?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
There was a meme not too long ago involving Quixo, the card, and someone saying they wanted a person just like Quixo, and then underneath was like, "I am that person."
Yeah.
And did that actually happen?
No. So they just made that meme for good times based on the art. I premiered it earlier in one of my first slides, but after you've been at Fantasy Flight Games for 5 years, you get to put your face into a game, and it just so happened that my 5-year lined up right when we were starting development on KeyForge, so I'm the card Quixo the Adventurer, in quotes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hey, my name's Mark from Creative Assembly in the UK. Having developed a game like Conquest in a very large, predefined world, and then creating a game like KeyForge in your own, what do you find more enjoyable?
Oh, they're both special in their own way. Working on Conquest was a big, lifelong dream for me. I'd been a really big Games Workshop fan for a long time, and so getting to really immerse myself in that world and work with them was a really interesting experience, but definitely one that was tailored in a way. They definitely had things about their IP they wanted to make sure came forth regardless of any personal predilection as I had. But KeyForge allows me and my team to really do what we'd like and build a world that we're happy with, and it's been a ton of fun. Comparability, I guess I prefer working on KeyForge, making my own stuff and making the jokes I want to make, to be honest, too. It is a very freeing experience, and building something for yourself is also a real treat. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kurt. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I have 2 questions.
Ooh.
So the first question is, the beginning of your talk was really exciting because I did not know a lot about the world building until those few slides. And I was actually thinking back to the cards, and there's not a lot of flavor text in it. So was that a very deliberate decision from your team? Because you are focusing on uniqueness. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, how do you balance the legacy cards? Because it's pretty elegant how you have sort of the more powerful decks come to retirement by themselves. So is there a really strict time frame for the legacy cards? Do you watch the meta in real time, or is it just through playtesting?
Okay, so first question was?
The flavor.
Yes, okay.
There's not a lot of flavor on the cards, and I learned everything in this talk.
So we use flavor very deliberately in KeyForge. We wanted to make sure that, one, we kept the lightness and the approachability of the universe. So where we could inject humor was often a time where we decided that we wanted flavor text to be here. There's a couple of different bits of world building here and there. Oh, excuse me. Bagel this morning. But we also wanted to make sure the cards felt clean and approachable. So we made sure to leave some cards just very open and again, readable, so that when you're picking up a deck for the first time, fanning out your cards, you don't feel intimidated. Second question, in terms of legacy cards, we did a lot of testing both with decks from the first set and decks from the second set, ensuring that both would be good in the same environment. And so that helped with a lot of our legacy testing to make sure that we weren't bringing anything forward that would be ridiculous. We also made sure to pair most cards that we saw, like and ensure that there wasn't anything going to be ridiculously broken, just in terms of looking at the pool altogether.
Yeah.
Is
Thanks.
that,
Yeah, I was thinking more like maybe like 5 years down the line, how many legacy cards would like survive, but
yeah, and we'll figure that out as we go, I think. You know, that's one of the things about KeyForge is it is a big experiment. It's very different. It's very strange. And so we're figuring out a lot of stuff as we go as well.
Hi, my name's Miles. I'm from here in San Francisco. I'm interested in the digital printing aspect of the game. So, firstly, from a production standpoint, how you're able to keep the cost down to $10 a deck, when obviously digital printing is a lot more expensive than mass production printing. And then secondly, as a designer, is Fantasy Flight looking at other games using this sort of thing? Because obviously it opens up a world of possibilities.
So in terms of digital printing, we did a lot of investigating into exactly how we were going to make this deck game. And so that was one thing we spent a lot of time on, especially the production department. But we finally found a digital printer in Germany, ran by this mad German scientist, essentially, trying to pioneer exactly how we were going to put these decks together. And he got this insanely interesting assembly line, which I wish I could talk more about, figured out, and has tons of different uniqueness checks all the way through. And essentially each and every deck is assigned a code at the beginning, and that code is rechecked every single step of the process. I can't go too much into it, just because, again, that's part of our trade secret, but that's that much I can tell. What was your second question again?
Just whether Fantasy Flight is interested in going on
Yes,
with this idea.
yes. Sorry. Short-term memory and whatnot. Definitely. We're very interested in the space it creates, and as the talk is, it's the world's first unique deck building game. I would imagine we'd want to explore the space in the future, especially since we put all the groundwork in, but I can't say anything about any future plans at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Quinn from Atherton, California, just south of here. And my question is, so the selling point of this is the deck uniqueness, but I suspect that a lot of players will at some point kind of want to maybe start designing their own decks, putting them together like a traditional card game. And it seems like that's something that is not that hard to support, given people could take cards from various decks and sleeve them. But the concern with that is that maybe that might undermine your business model a little bit, with people wanting to have to buy several decks to kind of find one they like. And I'm wondering how, if that sort of started to happen, or a community started to grow up around that, how you would support that or not support that, and what your thinking on that is.
My take on players building their own decks is that we've given them the tools, and if that really is something they want to do, then I'd say go for it. If they want to create the rules for it and they want to do that, that's their own thing. I feel like the way we present KeyForge is the most exciting and compelling way that the game can be played, and I would encourage players to do that, but far be it from me to tell players exactly how to play their games. In terms of official support, again, we believe that the format that KeyForge is in is the strongest format, and that is the one we're determined to support. But again, who knows? Everything's possible.
Thanks. I suspect that it would be because you didn't really test for that the constructed format would be kind of degenerate, which is probably why it wouldn't work out as
Likely, there's a lot of back-end rules that players can't see that regulate how decks are put together and whatnot. And obviously, players could make their own deck building restrictions or changes, but it's not something we're interested in pursuing ourselves. But again, if the player community wants to go for it, go for it.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lionel. I'm from New York City. I wanted to know, I have a couple of questions actually, but first of all, I wanted to know what are your thoughts on procedurally generating the cards themselves during development, and what it looks like for the future for that?
As far as procedural generation of actual cards, it's definitely something that's been really intriguing, and we talked a lot during the development of the game, and it's something Richard's definitely interested in pursuing. But The exact implementation of it is pretty difficult and not something we figured out yet. But it is something we're definitely looking at, and hopefully we'll see what happens in the future. Wish I could say more, but.
And my second question was, how did you handle the perhaps disparity between a player's play style and the play style of their deck?
Definitely, great question. So a player's play style versus the play style of the deck, and yeah, it can be really, really intriguing how you can pick up a deck and it plays either exactly like you'd want it to or completely differently. I find that the best combinations are when you can find a deck that fits your own play style. But one of the things we wanted to make sure through development is that there were tons of different play styles available through those randomized processes. And I think we've achieved that. There's lots of different types of decks out there, lots of decks doing well at tournaments, even decks that go counter to what the meta says is best. For example, with the Vault Tours that just happened this weekend, Shadows has been very much thought of as the best house, but the deck that won in Seattle didn't have Shadows in it at all. And so players are scratching their heads and trying to figure out that aspect of the game. And so, yes, you can find decks that aren't going to be exactly your play style, but I think you're most effective continuing to look for one that is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Brad.
Hey, handsome.
Hey. How's it going, Brad? This is Jonathan. We used to work together.
It's true.
So my question is actually about the design of the starter sets. In the original Call of the Archons for the new player experience, you included 2 non-randomized decks that were intended to be teaching decks. I understand that in the newest set, that is no longer the case, that it is just 2 completely unique decks. Is that true?
This is true.
Yeah, so what motivated kind of that decision to change the format of those starter decks and include like more tokens instead of those 2 kind of theoretically generic teaching decks?
Yes. So, as John put, in the first set, we included, in the core set, 2 non-randomized decks, the only 2 randomized decks, which aren't legal in tournament play, that are hand-picked and hand-designed to be easier for players to use and play with. This includes additional reminder text on the cards to explain mechanics, and these are designed to be played along with the quick start. Now, our feeling for the game was always that, very much like many other TCGs, players would not be typically learning through the rule book. They'd use it as more of a reference, which is why we again have a rule book and a quick start. The rule book has all of our FAQ, all of our clarifications there. So when the game was first coming out, players were going to need that to get a base install of players that knew how to play the game. Then, moving forward, our biggest portion of players were not going to be wanting those starter decks. They already knew how to play. They were looking for those new cards and those new experiences. So we focused on more tokens and more things that a player that's already invested in KeyForge would be interested in and could use to teach new players. So that became our motivation. Additionally, in the future, by not setting a trend of doing those starter decks, we free ourselves up for different exciting things to be in those starter sets, giving us more just wiggle room with our budgets.
Cool.
Oh, there we go. Hi, my name's Thomas. I'm from Cincinnati. A question on your testing methodology. So I have a deck that's the library access, draw your deck, forge 3 keys in 1 turn, and our store opened a double horseman deck. Were those sort of combinations specifically built during your testing phase? And how do you feel about them right now? Are they just an acceptable consequence of the variability of what decks can be? And with the specifically draw your deck loop type of decks, is that informing any future design on trying to limit that or lean into that design space?
You know, it's a really interesting, intriguing part of the design space. You know, we never even talked about the double horseman decks when we were working on the game, and so it was kind of a pleasant surprise. And you know, I printed one out and tested it, and it was fun and powerful, but definitely not the most powerful deck I had experienced. I also happened to open up one of the library access combo decks on our stream a while back, and you know, I lost that game. And it was really cool to me to have this combo deck be present in the environment, because combo decks are always something I used to play when I used to play a lot of TCGs. That was a fun archetype. However, we wanted to make sure that that archetype didn't dominate and has weaknesses, and that's the key. Combo decks are good for an environment only when there's counterplay. When there's counterplay that exists, then those combo decks don't run rampant. They aren't the be-all, end-all. And again, our results from this weekend's Fall Tour is very promising that those combo decks didn't do that well. They did okay. They were fun. I saw one that went 4-2, I believe in Eindhoven. But they weren't bringing home the bacon every time, because consistency is important. And those combos can be slow. They can be raced out. And so that's, I think, an important part. And so am I interested in having experiences in decks like that feel like they have that kind of synergy? Yes, I'm interested. But ones that make other decks obsolete, no. That I think that is not something we're interested in. And as we continue designing and developing the game, something we want to keep a close eye on.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hans from Stockholm, Sweden.
Hi, Hans.
I want to ask a couple of questions about the algorithm there. I realize it's the sort of secret sauce to everything, but I'm sure we all want to go home and kind of try to make our own, right? Just how complex is it? How many weird little rules are there in there?
So the algorithm is a little bit of two-stage. There is a long series of rules that dictate the exact deck construction. And then there is a longer list of rules that apply to individual cards. And so we have kind of a two-stage process there, in that a deck is generated and then it's checked against those individual card rules. And if it violates those, it's kicked out. So in terms of how complicated, man, pretty complicated. It's definitely a sight to behold. And so when I start to dive into that algorithm, when I start to work on a new deck, or excuse me, a new set, because we make sure to look at that every time we make a new set. And sometimes we'll need to add a new rule to, even on the base list of rules, we've had to add rules to be like, okay, I made this rule to accommodate this single card, but it's important that it functions exactly this way. So, man, I wish I could answer more about how complicated it is. Seven complicated.
Right. And just a quick follow-up though, like if you find a combo or a mechanic that is super overpowered, do you balance that only through frequency in the algorithm?
We can tackle it in many different ways. If we find it in playtesting, we can always alter the card and change it. Algorithm-wise, yeah, if we need to, we can dictate, okay, only one of this card can be in a deck, and it would be a combo if there was ever two. And from that, we can, mitigate that type of thing. So we can take a ton of different strategies that are novel to a game like KeyForge that you couldn't normally take. You can't, or would be intrusive to take. Because in a TCG, a lot of players will dislike when you're like, okay, you can only run one of this card. But if there's never more than one of that card anyways, then players will perceive it very differently. Right. And as a good friend once told me, perception is often reality.
All right, thank you. Love the game.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is David. I come from Montréal, Quebec. I come from a technical background. Actually, I'm a game developer who specializes in procedural gaming. And I was wondering, because you talk about the gazillion decks you can produce with the algorithm, what were the challenges to actually start making the first rules? I mean, we all have that white paper syndrome when we want to try something. But what was your first step on that, and how did you actually manage to go through it?
So some of the earliest steps we took was determining how many houses we wanted in the game, and then how many houses we wanted in a deck. And I don't remember the exact combination. I had a long discussion with Richard about this at one point. But with 7 houses and 3 in each, I'm trying to remember the probability that when you sit down to play with someone that you're sharing one house is, I think, in like 60 to 70% range. And because of that, it means that you'll have this very interesting overlap between those houses and how they interact with one another. If you have, say, shadows overlapping, you'll have this really interesting game where you guys are stealing amber back and forth, trying to figure out who can come out on top and forge those keys. And those different overlaps will create really compelling experiences. And so that's some of the earliest stuff we knew about when Richard originally brought the game to us. You know, it had 7 houses and 3 houses of each, and even the idea of having 36 cards, 12 of each, would give, you know, enough variety that you'd see, and there'd be enough just base material filling out that deck that you'd get that variety that you wanted. So a lot of it was from a mathematical, like, what makes sense to create good experiences. And that's where we kind of, you know, put our first marks on that white page, if you will.
Okay, excellent. And just to finish up, thank you for bringing back Legend of the Five Ring. It's a game I really liked, and you did an awesome game with that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, cheers.
Super short. Here we go. All right. Hi, I'm Kira. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I've got kind of general questions about just the card development process, the pipeline of that, so to speak, from just the general idea of what is the cycle for the development of a single card, as well as in the development cycle of then a set. Is it when you guys are doing testing, are you testing individual cards that you're introducing with a new type of mechanic, or is it that you create the set as a whole and then do another round of testing to see how the set actually functions together?
So with KeyForge, it's very much a design the whole set and design the whole environment, because unlike most other TCGs, KeyForge is about crafting in those environments. It's about crafting each house in a set to feel the way we want it to, and then generating a ton of decks to make sure that that house is consistently feeling that way. So when we created, you know, Call of the Archons, Logos plays a particular way. But in Age of Ascension, Logos might have a different take on it. It might play a different way. It might have a twist on what you've come to know and love. And so crafting that environment first for this game is integral. In terms of individual testing, we do some of that, especially with the amount of rares that we have, because as many players have noticed, there are more rares than any other type of card, which is bizarre and different for a game anyways. But we often will ask players to take decks that we've generated and play some games, and then swap out some of the rares in their deck with some of the other rares in that house to try and give additional testing to those cards. One, because of their complexity level, and two, I mean, just because they're cool, they're fun.
All righty. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Daniel from New York. This isn't so much as a question as just for everybody in the audience who maybe hasn't played it before. I'm a volunteer at the Shut Up and Sit Down Game Lounge, and we have KeyForge over there, and volunteers would love to play it with you. So just for everybody in the audience who wants to check it out.
Thank you very much. We have time for, I think, one more question, which is good, because it looks like there's one more person in line.
Yeah, I'm also Daniel, but from San Francisco. How did you guys handle prize support for like tournaments and stuff? It's most card games would give like foils and alternate art cards, but it seems like it would be difficult for a game like this.
Yeah. So let me pop back a couple slides to our Master Vault app and website, because you can take your decks that you own and register them on the Master Vault app to your personal profile, and for every deck that you register, you're going to get our digital currency called an Amber Shard. Now, when you're participating in a tournament, you're going to get additional Amber Shards for each round that you play and win in. Now, our Amber Shards can be spent at our prize walls at all of our Vault Tour events to get various things like hoodies, pins, playmats, all sorts of different KeyForge merchandise. There's even the top level is a customized KeyForge gaming table that players can purchase if they have enough Amber Shards. So that is how we distribute prizes for KeyForge, is a prize wall that you can go to and enjoy. It encourages players to come to our Vault Tours and have a good time and pick up some great prizes. It also means that a player that's at their store every week playing games can be just as rewarded as a player that goes out and can win any tournament.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys all very, very much for having me today. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your GDC.